In this section, we'll look at Roosevelt's imperialism other than the Panama Canal, focusing more on the later years of his term in office. Certainly, the Panama Canal was an example of Roosevelt's interest in the Caribbean at large. He was interested in more than just the canal. Early in Roosevelt's presidency, Germany, Britain, and Italian warships had bombarded Venezuela, which had reneged on its debts to those countries. And 2 years later, in 1904, a number of European countries had threatened to invade the Dominican Republic if it had reneged on what it owed them. If any nation intervened in the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt believed, it should be the United States. Accordingly, in December 1904, Roosevelt denied any territorial interest in Latin America, but declared unequivocally that the United States would intervene whenever there was, quote, chronic wrongdoing by Latin American governments. Roosevelt clearly left wrongdoing vague, and it was quickly stated that America had become the, quote, policeman of the Caribbean. Roosevelt developed a more defined rationale in time that became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary was something that was added. The Monroe Doctrine had declared that Europe should stay out of North, Central, and South America. Roosevelt added that if the Americans wanted the Europeans to stay out of their affairs, as the Monroe Doctrine said, they, the Americans, had an obligation to keep their affairs in order. They should not let disorder or disagreement among themselves become an excuse for a European intervention. The U.S., therefore, was needed to keep order. Now, unstated, of course, naturally, was the reality that U.S. intervention always advanced U.S. interests, not merely those of the other American countries. Over the next 3 decades, the United States constantly intervened in Latin America. In this picture here, one can see the many instances in which the United States, either economically or militarily, interjected itself into the Caribbean or Central South America. Many of these people developed this sentiment of Yankee go home. Roosevelt took whatever opportunities he could find to advance American interests. This was particularly evident when Russia and Japan went to war in 1904. In 1900, exploiting the turmoil caused by the Boxer uprisings, Russian troops had occupied Manchuria, which was just north of China. Russia began building railroads connecting Manchuria to Russia, and this alarmed the Japanese, who also had designs on Manchuria and nearby Korea. In 1904, a surprise Japanese attack destroyed Russian ships anchored at Port Arthur, Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 thus had begun, and Japan quickly gained the upper hand. While pleased to see Russian expansionism checked, Roosevelt worried about the new Japanese expansionism, fearful that it might challenge America's new possessions in the Philippines and Guam. Accordingly, he invited Japan and Russia to a peace conference at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in September 1905. There, Roosevelt helped negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth. Russia recognized Japan's control of Korea and made other territorial concessions. It was the first time ever an Asian power had checked the expansion of a European power. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, but his real goal was to assure that Japan remained centered in the northern Pacific, leaving, of course, the Philippines and the southern Pacific for the United States. Roosevelt tended to look down on the Asian peoples, but he respected the Japanese. When Japan began treating the Manchurians harshly, Manchuria had just been awarded to them, the Chinese asked Roosevelt to intervene. Roosevelt declined. When, in 1906, the San Francisco School Board, reflecting the hostility of, against the wave of Asian immigrants, assigned Asian students to segregated classes, Japan protested. Roosevelt responded by summoning the school board to Washington and persuading them to drop their discriminatory policies. In return, in 1908, the United States and Japan negotiated a so-called, quote, gentleman's agreement, whereby Japan promised to halt Japanese immigration to America. Roosevelt wanted to keep a balance of power and peace in Asia to advance, of course, America's interests there. That same year, 1908, Roosevelt's last year in office, Roosevelt also included the Rutekahara Agreement. Here, both nations proclaimed their interest in maintaining the status quo in the Pacific. Each would respect the territorial possessions of others and would continue to support open door in China, which benefited them all. This concludes the section on Roosevelt's imperialism.